So, when it comes to landmarks, it doesn't get more instantly recognizable than the cascading shells of the Sydney Opera House. Like sails on the water, the Opera House boasts dramatic visibility from all sides of Bennelong Point, jutting out into Sydney Harbour. It's because of this iconic status that I'm often less drawn to recreating these kinds of landmarks in the first place. Sydney Opera House certainly has been recreated effectively in bricks at a variety of scales over many years, but to my knowledge, none have approached my signature 1:650 scale, as they tend to be either very tiny or dramatically larger, like any of the 3 LEGO kits which have featured this Australian landmark. So at the very least, my reconstruction fills a glaring gap in the range of scales. Beyond that, it was also high time I added a distinctly Australian landmark to my body of work, collectively titled Brick Odyssey. Along with other recent projects like Taipei 101 and Dome of the Rock, this piece expands the scope of my gallery exhibition to previously unexplored corners of the world, with plenty more to come in the near future. Before we dive into the build-out for this project, I want to take a moment to thank GoBricks for providing the bricks to build this piece. I don't do ad reads on any of my videos, but I feel it is important to let you know that there are viable alternative brick manufacturers who actually strive to meaningfully support artists like myself working in this medium. GoBricks are a very high quality alternative plastic bricks with a staggering variety of familiar and original colors, with a level of quality control that rivals any other brick manufacturers out there. They're completely compatible with your existing collections and are available in limitless quantities at extremely competitive prices. You can check out everything GoBricks have to offer at their new online marketplace, brickwith.com. You can also support me directly by using the Brickwith affiliate link in the description below and in my bio. Now, without further ado, let's get into these build insights. Sydney Opera House is not a landmark I had planned on reconstructing, but one day in late 2024, my good friend and colleague Warren Elsmore reached out, asking if I'd be up for some subcontracting work involving the Opera House. The brief was to recreate a city skyline of Sydney, focused on the Opera House, but with a bit of the surrounding harbour in forced perspective. The client was the American Airlines C.R. Smith Museum in Dallas, where you can see the skyline today, alongside several others, as if they're being viewed from the window of a plane. Since I was going to all that effort to design an original piece, I decided the Opera House would be at my usual 1:650 scale, allowing me to eventually recreate a more definitive version later on. Like all my original reconstructions, I went to great lengths to include the immediate surroundings as well as the landmark itself. Sydney Opera House is situated on Bennelong Point in Sydney Harbour, and as a result features silt accretions along the eastern edge of the peninsula. This ephemeral aspect of the design is actually included here in the reconstruction, where I used tan and dark tan plates beneath 1 and 2 layers of transparent blue plates. This technique added a gradient along the eastern edge before the plates transitioned to transparent bricks, under which dark blue elements represent the deeper waters. The bricks used throughout most of the harbour waters are 2x2 bricks, which more closely match the underside tube structure of the pair of vintage 12x12 rounded bricks used along the north boundary of the piece. These bricks were featured in a single set from 2002, and if I'm being honest, they're far from the perfect solution in this particular case, mostly due to the slight mismatch in shades of transparent light blue elements. But the far more important factor for me here was ensuring that the water remained as simple and as brick-built as possible to effectively contrast with the studless slopes and wedges used primarily in the design of the Opera House above. The 12x12 bricks also serve as a callback to my 2021 piece depicting the Biblioteca Alexandrina, where I used another pair for glimpses of the Mediterranean Sea on each corner. Back when I designed Sydney Opera House in early 2025, the process was basically the reverse order of what I'm showing you in these build insights. Except for large, sprawling landscapes that fit together like a giant puzzle, just like my enormous SPQR diorama, I tend to integrate the surrounding landscape after the featured building itself is designed to a satisfactory point. So these plaza details being built here were actually digitally designed after I had already completely figured out the 3 buildings of the Opera House. Now, this particular street-level surface is located along the approach to the peninsula, and it features a scallop cobblestone pattern between the vertically oriented rows of tiles. But these particular patterns abut the raised plinth, which had yet to be added by this point, so we'll return to add the scalloped pavement in the next segment. The irregular curve which characterizes the tip of Bennelong Point was accomplished using a daisy chain of 1x2 rounded plates, which defines the retaining wall below. A variety of slopes and angled parts were carefully aligned to match the curvature of the retaining wall, which was capped off with a distinct shade of light gray available exclusively from Go Bricks. This off-white shade contrasts ever so subtly with the white used for the opera house above. The rest of the surrounding base of the plinth uses the same array of vertically oriented 1x2 plates in light nougat. Sydney Opera House is approached on foot via the dramatic staircase to the south of the signature buildings. The design features layers upon layers of carefully placed panels oriented sideways to evoke the dozens of steps leading up to the buildings. The first series of steps cleverly conceals a driveway underneath, where visitors to the site can access parking garages beneath Bennelong Point. With the stairs of the plinth in place, it was time to add the aforementioned scallop cobblestones to the surrounding pavement. This particular design is completely original to this project, and I view it as a natural progression of the countless mosaic patterns implemented throughout my ancient Rome diorama. Whereas typically I'll place decorated or colored tiles directly on studs, this technique began with the prompt, what if the tiles weren't bound by the limited number of studs below? An effective scallop cobblestone technique has eluded me for quite a while to this point, so when I realized this technique would require cutting the end cap 1x1/4 circle tiles in half, I didn't hesitate to do exactly that. As you can see in the two examples shown here, this technique can be applied both to linear rows as well as along angled edges. The last thing I'll add before we head to the Opera House buildings themselves is that the plinth was faced with local pink granite from Tarrana just outside Sydney and further afield from the Black Hills region. No, not the Black Hills of South Dakota, the ones of South Australia. While the entire plinth and most of the surrounding pavement are roughly the same color in reality, I chose to represent them as distinctly tan and light nougat for better overall legibility given the relatively modest size of the overall piece. The Sydney Opera House is comprised of 3 visually separate buildings, each of which are interconnected through the plinth on which they're perched. The smallest of the 3 is situated at the back of the peninsula and is home to the Bennelong Restaurant. Essentially a miniature version of the 2 larger, more iconic structures, this fine dining restaurant features 2 of the signature shells facing opposite directions and straddles multiple levels of the plinth staircase. The sails featured here, while dramatically smaller than those used in the 2 larger buildings, were derived from sections of the same sphere, which was the eureka moment that took this overall project from a conceptual proposal to a feasible project which could be effectively engineered within an economy of scale. Sydney Opera House was designed by Danish architect Jorn Utzon and was formally opened on October 20th, 1973 by Queen Elizabeth II. The landmark was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2007, which was an extremely rare feat for such a relatively modern work. The spaces within the 2 main buildings of the Opera House contain auditoriums for both operas and for concerts. The smaller of the 2 halls shown here accommodates just over 1,500 seats, which is not all that many for a modern venue. My reconstruction was designed so that each building would be removable from the plinth, given the fragility of the shells. The only recognizable parts of the base of the opera hall are the tinted windows along the sides and the vast glass canopies facing the harbor, which I'd liken to either the baleen of a partially agape whale or some kind of Darth Vader ventilator. The exposed interior scaffolding gives way to the iconic white shells of the exterior. Now, calling these forms shells is more of a colloquialism than any structural indication. In fact, the shells of the Opera House are made up of a latticework of precast concrete ribs, onto which precast concrete panels were mounted. The panels were then covered in more than 1 million glazed tiles, manufactured by a Swedish ceramics shop, and actually feature a subtle chevron pattern on closer inspection. My reconstruction of the Opera House actually features hints of these chevron patterns thanks to various triangular and chamfered tiles used for the exterior finish. The third and final building to be added was the concert hall, with an audience capacity of around 2,700. As I mentioned earlier, this build-out for my Sydney Opera House reconstruction was a near-complete inversion of the digital design process, since this concert hall was actually the very first part of the project that I designed back in 2025. In terms of size, this building is about 2 studs wider than the Opera Hall, which may not seem like much, but actually cascaded across the whole design of each building. None of my designs are copied and pasted in the first place, but it is worth emphasizing that this was no mere adjustment of a couple parts between the concert and opera halls. The two featured altogether different dimensions, and to the extent that techniques were carried over from one to the other, much of the part selection had to be adjusted according to the two sizes, while still effectively looking like identical buildings at two different scales. Part of the genius of the engineering behind the Sydney Opera House was its economy of scale. While the project's architect Jorn Utzon is credited with the overall vision, it's far more likely that the project engineers were responsible for consolidating the variously sized shells into segments of a single uniform sphere. You've probably all heard the analogy of imagining each shell of the Sydney Opera House as a portion of a single large orange peel. It certainly makes for a great story about the design of one of the most famous buildings in the world, but there's actually quite a bit of truth to the overall concept. In the end, resolving the shells to sections of the same sphere allowed for the manufacture of 2,400 precast concrete ribs in lieu of cost-prohibitive formworks. Here in my reconstruction, both buildings are situated roughly 22.5 degrees relative to the peninsula's centerline. The finishing touches added to Sydney Opera House were the man-o'-war steps on the east side, as well as the signature bronze lamps. The real Opera House features 51 of these lamps along the edges of Bennelong Point, and they're affectionately called Hall's Balls after architect Peter Hall, who designed many of the project's interior and exterior finishes after Jon Utzon left the project in 1966. A last-minute Easter egg was the addition of Benny the Seal, who Sydney Siders have lovingly named after the peninsula. Apparently, the secret to Benny's regular appearances on the landing at the tip of the peninsula is that he's actually more than one seal. The final touch, as always, was my signature tile, engraved by the folks over at Brick Engraver and placed in the water of Sydney Harbour. I hope you enjoyed these insights into the build-out of Sydney Opera House. A quick shout out to all my members over on Patreon who help to support my work. Projects like this take many months to realize, and patrons get to see every step along the way, like the digital design insights for Sydney Opera House, which were shared several months earlier in January 2026. It also bears repeating, I don't do ad reads, so if you find my work to be valuable, I'd appreciate if you'd consider returning some of that value by becoming a member on Patreon. You'll find a link in the description. Thanks so much for following along, and until next time, I'm Rocco Buttliere, and this is my Brick Odyssey.